The radio cracked with static at 6:00 a.m., but Detective Jack Walsh didn't respond. He never would again. Imagine that for a second. The most trusted man in Fremont, Nebraska, the one person who everyone thought was untouchable, found slumped in his own patrol truck. Not in some dark alley in a big city, but on Maple Avenue, the quietest street in town. If you're watching this right now, make sure you subscribe, because this is not just another story. It's a story about trust, betrayal, and how even the safest towns can carry the darkest secrets. And I promise you, by the end of this case, you'll see small-town America in a way you never imagined before. Fremont in 1998 was the kind of place that still sold the idea of safety as if it was bottled water. Doors stayed unlocked. Children biked to school without fear. Teenagers cruised Main Street on Friday nights with nothing worse on their record than loud mufflers. And standing tall in the middle of it all was Detective Jack Walsh, 37 years old, 15 years on the force, the kind of cop people pointed to when they told their kids, "See, that's what a good man looks like." He wasn't just a detective. He was a symbol. He remembered names. He listened. He treated even petty thefts like they mattered because, to the victims, they did. Jack Walsh had that brand of Midwest integrity carved right out of the prairie soil. Which is exactly why his death didn't just shock Fremont. It shattered it. If Jack Walsh could be murdered, then maybe the rules everyone trusted weren't real at all. Maybe the invisible shield of small-town peace was nothing more than glass, and someone had just thrown a stone. That October morning had started like so many others. Walsh was covering a routine patrol shift for a younger officer who had called in sick. Nothing unusual about that. Jack never minded extra duty. It gave him a chance to drive the quiet neighborhoods, nod to the insomniacs walking their dogs, and check in on the widows who always kept their porch lights on a little too late. His last confirmed radio call came around 2:00 a.m. "All quiet on Elm Street," he said after checking on Mrs. Patterson, who'd been worried about teenagers cutting through her yard. His voice was calm, steady. Just another night in Fremont. No one could have guessed that in less than 5 hours he'd be dead. At sunrise, the first person to notice something wrong wasn't a fellow officer. It was Margaret Sullivan, a 50-year-old jogger whose daily 3-mile route had been the same for over a decade. She was used to spotting Jack's patrol car now and then. It made her feel safer. But that morning, something felt different. The engine was running. Exhaust puffed into the cold October air. The windows were fogged. The silhouette inside didn't move. Margaret slowed her pace, then stopped altogether. Something in her stomach dropped. In 12 years of running, she had never seen stillness like this. She took a hesitant step closer, then another. And when she finally peered through the condensation, her life in Fremont was changed forever. Inside Unit 23 sat Detective Jack Walsh, slumped forward against the steering wheel. A single bullet wound in his chest. His service weapon still holstered. His eyes open but empty. No shattered glass, no sign of struggle, just silence. Margaret screamed. A raw sound that echoed down Maple Avenue like a siren. Lights snapped on in the houses nearby. Neighbors rushed out in bathrobes, confused and horrified. Within minutes, 911 had been called. Police cruisers screeched to the curb, and Fremont was staring at its first murder scene in over 60 years. The crime scene itself made no sense. Here was their most experienced detective. A man who could talk down armed suspects, who had solved missing person cases others had written off. Sitting in his own patrol vehicle, killed at point-blank range, and not a single clue in sight. No shell casings, no footprints in the dew, no neighbors who heard anything. The only sound was the radio still crackling. For Chief Robert Fitzgerald, the sight was almost too much to process. He had worked alongside Walsh for 2 decades, watched him grow from rookie to department star. And now, standing on Maple Avenue with crime scene tape fluttering in the breeze, he realized that Fremont had just crossed a line it could never uncross. They didn't even have homicide detectives on staff. Why would they? The town's biggest crimes had always been drunk driving, bar fights, and the occasional meth lab in an abandoned farmhouse. But now their best man was dead. And worse than the grief was the question hanging in the air. If Jack Walsh wasn't safe, who was? The townspeople gathered at the edges of the tape, whispering, some crying, others simply staring in disbelief. Mothers pulled their children back inside. Fathers folded their arms as if bracing against a storm that had no clouds. The body of Jack Walsh was taken away, but the silence he left behind seemed to spread across Fremont like frost. For the first time in living memory, people began locking their doors at night. Porch lights stayed on later. Conversations turned to suspicion: who could have done this? Why? That was the hook the killer had driven straight into the heart of Fremont. Not just the murder of a man, but the murder of certainty itself. For Margaret Sullivan, the woman who found him, nightmares began that very night. She replayed the image again and again. The fog glass, the stillness, the blood that had dried into his uniform. She told investigators every detail she could remember, but it was never enough. And deep down she knew, it wasn't just her who had stumbled upon the crime. It was Fremont itself. The whole town had been pulled into a nightmare that had no ending in sight. By the time the sun was fully up, local media had already swarmed the block. Reporters spoke words that sounded foreign in the context of Fremont. Execution style. Point blank. National outlets picked it up by afternoon. America was suddenly staring at a town it had never heard of, asking how something like this could happen in the middle of Nebraska. But those questions had no answers, not yet. What everyone agreed on, though, was this: Detective Jack Walsh wasn't just another victim. He was the victim, the one man who had stood for everything Fremont thought it was: safety, fairness, trust. His death wasn't just a tragedy, it was an earthquake. And the aftershocks were only beginning. Jack Walsh hadn't just been a detective, he had been Fremont's anchor. To understand why his death cut so deep, you have to first understand the man himself. Born and raised in Nebraska farmland, Jack grew up with a kind of discipline that only small towns can teach. His father had worked the rail yards, his mother the local library. Money was always tight, but respect was never in short supply. Jack was the oldest of 3 brothers, and from the time he was 12, he was the one who made sure the younger 2 got home safe after school. He learned early that responsibility wasn't something you waited to be handed. It was something you picked up because it needed carrying. By high school, Jack was known as the kid who'd stand up to bullies twice his size and still make it to football practice on time. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy, but when he spoke, people leaned in. That quiet leadership followed him to the police academy, where he graduated top of his class. In Fremont, they didn't need convincing to hire him. By the time he turned 22, he had already walked the same neighborhoods he'd once biked as a kid, only now with a badge pinned to his chest. Colleagues remembered him as meticulous but never arrogant. He'd double-check crime scene photos, cross-reference witness statements, and always return phone calls, even the ones that didn't seem urgent. To him, every resident mattered: a lost wallet, a broken window, a runaway teenager. Jack treated them all with the same seriousness. Maybe that's why people trusted him with things they wouldn't tell anyone else. Fremont wasn't a place where secrets lasted long, but if you had one, Jack Walsh was the man you could trust to handle it gently. At home, life was simpler. He had married young, his high school sweetheart Anna. Their marriage had its bumps, the kind any long relationship collects, but together they raised a daughter, Claire, who was 6 years old when Fremont lost him. Jack was the kind of father who showed up to every school play, every soccer game, even if it meant running from a late shift, still wearing his duty belt. He'd crouch by the sidelines, give a thumbs up, and make his daughter believe that nothing in the world could touch her, as long as Dad was watching. It was this image of a man whose life was built on routine kindness that made his murder feel not just violent, but impossible. In a town where everyone thought they knew everyone else's story, the question wasn't just who would kill him. The question was who could. As the hours after his death stretched into days, Fremont became a mirror turned against itself. People who once waved at neighbors began looking twice, asking silent questions. Was the killer a stranger passing through? Or had someone in their own community pulled the trigger? The thought alone felt poisonous, but nobody could shake it. Investigators tried to answer those questions with evidence, but what little they had seemed almost taunting. The patrol truck had no forced entry. Jack's weapon was untouched. There were no defensive wounds. Whoever killed him had either caught him completely off guard, or was someone he trusted enough not to raise his guard at all. That detail landed like a stone in the gut of every officer on the force. If Jack Walsh wasn't safe among his own, then maybe none of them were. Chief Fitzgerald spoke at a press conference 2 days later. The town gathered at the Civic Center, filling folding chairs under buzzing fluorescent lights. The chief's voice cracked only once when he said Jack's name, but otherwise he was steady. He promised a thorough investigation. He promised that no stone would be left unturned. But as cameras flashed and notebooks scribbled, the truth was already visible in the lines under his eyes. Fremont didn't have the manpower, the technology, or the experience to chase a killer who could pull off something this clean. Still, the community tried to rally. Candlelight vigils were held on the courthouse lawn. Farmers parked their pickups in rows and prayed with heads bowed. The diner where Jack often stopped for pie taped black ribbon to the windows. And in church basements, conversations turned to hushed theories. Some said it had to be a drifter. Others whispered about old grudges. A few dared to wonder if corruption inside the department itself could have played a role. Every theory felt like an accusation, and every accusation chipped away at the fragile trust that held the town together. Anna Walsh, Jack's widow, avoided the public eye as much as she could. She focused on her daughter, who couldn't understand why her father's patrol truck was suddenly on the evening news. "Daddy's at work," she said once, and Anna didn't have the heart to correct her. At the funeral, held at St. Mark's, the sanctuary overflowed. Officers from 3 counties stood in dress uniforms, saluting as Jack's casket passed. Bagpipes wailed through the October air. It should have been a day of closure, but for Fremont, it was only the beginning of an open wound. What made the wound worse was how little progress followed. Forensic work in the late 90s was nowhere near what it is today. DNA testing was limited, ballistics required pristine evidence, and the crime scene had offered nothing pristine at all. Jack's clothing was tested, but results came back inconclusive. His vehicle was dusted for prints, but nothing matched. The bullet itself had been fired from a .38 revolver, one of the most common handguns in America, a needle in a stack of needles. Fremont was left with grief but no answers. And in that silence suspicion grew. People noticed who looked away at the grocery store. They remembered small slights, old arguments, petty feuds, and wondered if any of them could have turned into murder. It was paranoia in slow motion, spreading like frostbite. And all the while, the file in the evidence room grew thicker but no closer to a solution. Jack's name was added to the memorial wall of Nebraska officers lost in the line of duty. His badge was retired. Framed and hung in the station lobby, children left flowers. Veterans saluted and still no arrest came. Fremont remained polite on the surface, but underneath it carried the weight of a question nobody could answer. If it wasn't a stranger, then it had to be one of us. Who among us is capable of killing Jack Walsh? The crime scene told 2 stories at once, one too loud, the other too quiet. The loud one was obvious. Detective Jack Walsh had been shot execution style, while still seated in his patrol truck. His engine was running, headlights cutting into the fog, radio still alive with static. The quiet story, though, was the one investigators couldn't stop staring at. How could something so violent leave behind so little? Crime scene technicians worked the patrol vehicle with the patience of surgeons. They photographed every angle, dusted every surface, lifted every fiber they could find. The windows were rolled up, doors locked. No shattered glass, no forced entry, no blood spatter beyond the immediate wound. It was as if Walsh had simply let someone approach, maybe even welcomed them close, before a single round ended his life. The bullet was lodged in the seat cushion, flattened by bone and fabric. .38 caliber, common enough to be carried by almost anyone, from a farmer to a drifter to a fellow cop. No shell casing was found, which suggested a revolver. That detail narrowed nothing. In 1998, revolvers were still everywhere in Nebraska, passed down through families like pocket watches. Fingerprints were scarce. Walsh's own were expected, of course, along with smudges too partial to match. The steering wheel and gearshift showed nothing useful. Investigators examined the door handles, the dashboard, even the rearview mirror, desperate for anything that might break the silence. What they found instead was absence, the kind of absence that feels intentional. The theory that haunted them most was betrayal. If Jack had lowered his guard, it meant he had trusted the person who killed him. That narrowed the field not by weapon, but by relationship. The possibility cut deep. Fremont's best detective, a man who defined trust for the town, may have been betrayed by it. Neighbors were questioned in waves. A woman watering her plants before dawn said she noticed the glow of headlights, but assumed it was routine patrol. An older couple 2 houses down swore they hadn't heard a sound, not even the shot. Some pointed fingers at drifters, others at long-haul truckers passing through, but nobody could explain how an outsider would get that close to Jack without raising suspicion. At the station, the evidence board filled quickly. Photos of the truck, a map of Maple Avenue, timelines scribbled in red marker, and at the center, a portrait of Walsh in uniform, pinned like a challenge. Chief Fitzgerald called in assistance from the Nebraska State Patrol, but even with more resources, the puzzle pieces refused to fit. Jack's personal life was dissected. His marriage was examined, his finances scrutinized, his friendships picked apart for cracks. But what they found was what everyone already knew: Jack Walsh was clean. No debts, no affairs, no secret vices waiting to be unearthed. If anything, the investigation only deepened the mystery. Rumors filled the vacuum where answers should have been. Some whispered that Walsh had stumbled onto a case bigger than Fremont could handle, maybe tied to meth routes creeping into rural Nebraska. Others speculated about retaliation from a suspect he'd arrested years earlier. And then there was the theory nobody wanted to say out loud, that it had been one of their own. Inside the department, that theory stung the worst. The officers who had trained with Walsh, who had shared midnight shifts and cups of bitter coffee, now eyed one another with hesitation. Could someone in uniform have been the one? The question was corrosive. Trust, once fractured, doesn't glue back easily. One piece of physical evidence offered a sliver of hope. On Walsh's jacket sleeve, technicians found a faint trace of fabric. Blue coarse, not part of his own uniform. It was bagged, logged, and sent to the lab. Weeks later, the report came back inconclusive. The fragment was too degraded, too generic. It could have come from a jacket sold in 100 stores across the Midwest. The absence of answers began shaping the town itself. Kids no longer played outside after dark. Neighbors formed informal watch groups, men standing on porches with shotguns across their laps. Fremont, which had once prided itself on never locking doors, now jingled with padlocks and chains. The murder of Jack Walsh wasn't just a crime. It was a contagion, spreading fear into every corner. Anna Walsh lived through those days in a haze. Every knock on her door jolted her heart. Every police cruiser passing by made her hope for news that never came. She wore her husband's badge on a chain around her neck, not as comfort but as a weight, a reminder of promises broken. Their daughter Claire, too young to understand the machinery of homicide, asked the same question each night before bed. Did they find the bad guy yet? Anna had no answer that wouldn't make the world even darker than it already was. The investigation pushed outward. State Patrol canvassed pawn shops for recently sold revolvers. Federal agencies were contacted, though few gave more than polite interest. Leads dribbled in, mostly dead ends. A trucker spotted in town that night, later cleared. A drifter arrested for burglary, no connection. A bitter ex-con from Omaha who had once shouted Walsh's name in a courtroom, but who had an alibi backed by video surveillance. Each time a suspect emerged, hope flickered, and each time it was snuffed out. Months passed, then a year. The file thickened with interviews, tips, and lab reports, none of them conclusive. Officers rotated shifts at the evidence board, staring at it like a riddle in a language nobody spoke. Fremont adjusted, if you could call it that. The wound didn't close, it simply became part of the landscape, like the courthouse dome or the water tower. People learned to live around it, even if they never truly forgot. And that was the cruelest part. The absence of answers became its own kind of answer. The killer had slipped through Fremont's fingers, and in doing so had proven something unthinkable. Even in a small town where everyone knew everyone, someone could commit the ultimate betrayal and walk away unseen. By the summer of 1999, the case had cooled. Not officially, no detective ever stamped it, unsolved, and walked away. But leads slowed, tips dried up, and the board in the station began to collect more dust than updates. Jack Walsh's murder had become the kind of story told in lowered voices, punctuated by head shakes and sighs. Fremont carried on, but it carried on differently. Some nights Chief Fitzgerald would sit alone in his office, staring at the framed badge of his fallen detective. He would replay the evidence, the interviews, the timeline, over and over, searching for the crack that might let light through. But none came. And in that silence, Fremont began living with the possibility that maybe justice wasn't coming after all. The first winter after Jack's murder came down hard. Like the sky had decided Fremont needed burying. Snow softened every edge, rooftops, fences, the yellow curbs along Maple Avenue. But it couldn't blunt the way people looked at one another now. Neighbors who used to wave from their porches started measuring distance in door locks and deadbolts. The diner filled each morning with mugs clinking and voices kept low, as if speaking too loudly might summon whatever had climbed into Unit 23 and pulled the trigger. Inside the police station, the corkboard carried more pins than answers. A young officer named Pete Calder took to standing in front of it after night shift, reciting the timeline under his breath like a prayer. 2 a.m. welfare check. 4:35. Silent streets. 6:35. Headlights idling in the cold. 6:40. A jogger's scream that the town still heard when the wind slipped just right through the maples. He'd reach the end and stop, as if repetition could tease out a letter the earlier reader had missed. What wore people down wasn't just grief, it was the math of the thing. The .38 hollow point fired close, no casing, likely a revolver, a shot through a rolled-down window or worse, a conversation that invited the murderer close enough to smell Jack's coffee. In a big city that might lead to 100 suspects. In Fremont it led to the worst theory, that the person who approached the car had a face Jack recognized and a voice that didn't raise his guard. Ballistics wasn't the magic key anyone hoped for. The fragments were clean in a way that was almost impolite, rifling marks too pristine, as if the barrel had been polished between sins. The state lab sent back reports that read like riddles. The bullet fit 1,000 guns and none of them exactly. The tech scribbled a note in the margin, exceptionally maintained barrel, and slid the file across a desk already crowded with maybes. At City Hall, town council meetings stretched later, frayed thinner. People who'd never spoken into a microphone took turns at the podium describing how they used to feel and how they felt now. One older man said he hadn't slept a full night since October without waking to check his front window twice, sometimes 3 times. A mother stood with a toddler on her hip and admitted that she parked her stroller in the living room facing the door, like she was keeping watch on behalf of everyone who couldn't. Nobody mentioned the word failure, but it hung there anyway, the way cold clings to your coat long after you come inside. The newspaper tried to balance hope and accuracy. Investigation continues. The headline promised each week or two. Inside, careful paragraphs sketched out new leads that weren't. A truck spotted at the edge of town. A caller who hung up when asked to spell his name. A man in a canvas jacket seen talking to a cop car somewhere on Maple. Or maybe it was Linden, maybe it was last Tuesday. Maybe it was a different year altogether. Memory, it turns out, is not built for cross-examination. Anna Walsh kept the curtains open. People suggested she shut them, that it might help. But she refused. Jack had liked the morning sun on that side of the house. It landed on the kitchen table at 9 in winter, later in summer, and turned his coffee from black to the color of wet bark. The badge she wore around her neck found that light most mornings, flashed once on the wall like a signal no one could decode, and then went still. She taught herself to fix the back step, to toss out leftovers on time, to answer in sentences when strangers at the grocery store asked how she was holding up. She learned the strange choreography of post, tragedy living, keep moving, look people in the eye, decline casseroles after the freezer is full, write thank you notes to men who don't know where to put their hands. At the station, A forensic trainer from Lincoln came in with a slide deck and a voice that carried more science than comfort. He taught the department new ways to collect trace evidence. Talked about touch DNA like it was a future you could order from a catalog if your budget behaved. He looked at the Unit 23 file and shook his head gently. The kind of shake that says you didn't do anything wrong, but time and weather did. He left behind swabs and protocols and the sense that the next case might go better. It didn't change the current one. Not all fractures were public. Some split quietly under uniforms. Officers who'd done thousands of traffic stops suddenly found their hands hovering longer near their holsters, their eyes lingering on rear hands' mirror angles. The glint of nothing in a driver's lap. Every single one of them told themselves they weren't spooked. Every single one of them was. When your best cop can die with his gun holstered, the world's angles tilt for everyone. A rumor floated through a December like ash after a field fire evidence had gone missing in a case the year before. Some drug money miscounted, a bag weighed wrong. It wasn't tied to Jack and it wasn't proven, but rumors ask for oxygen, not proof. It caught burned quietly, and left behind questions that looked suspiciously like accusations. The chief called a closed-door meeting and repeated, slow and careful, that the department would audit every locker. Every log. He spoke like a man blinking through smoke. The audit found nothing headline-worthy. Locks were replaced anyway. Keys were signed in and out with new pens that left bigger ink. The evidence room took on the antiseptic cleanliness of a hospital room kept ready for a patient who might never arrive. The implication of all that order was its own kind of disorder. If you had to tidy this much now, what does that say about before? Out by the grain elevators, a father took his son pheasant hunting, and realized halfway through that they weren't talking about birds. The boy wanted to know how close you'd have to stand to shoot a man through a window, and whether people in uniform were safer, or just felt like they were. The father answered the first question in distances and the second one not at all. Later that night he told his wife he'd never felt so clumsy with the truth. The winter cracked. Finally, in March, snow retreated into ditches and under hedges. Grass sang the returning color it'd been holding back for months. On Maple Avenue, the curb where Unit 23 had idled looked like any other curb again, which felt like both a mercy and a theft. Margaret Sullivan laced her Reeboks and tried her jogging route for the first time since October. She paused where she'd screamed and made herself look directly at the space the truck had taken up. "Good morning," she whispered to nothing, to Jack, to the version of Fremont that still believed mornings belonged to coffee and school buses and not to autopsies. Then she ran again. Spring didn't fix the case, it never does, but it loosened tongues just enough that one old rumor snowballed into something more specific. A part-time evidence clerk in Grand Island. Someone's cousin, someone else's classmate, mentioned to a friend in Fremont that a state investigator used to borrow items longer than the logbooks suggested. The word borrow did a lot of work there. It suggested a return, it suggested permission, it suggested that paperwork was a map and the territory was something else entirely. By the time this whisper looped its way to the chief's office, it carried with it a single name and the sickening possibility that the worst theory, the one about betrayal, might not be a theory at all. No one wanted to touch it. You don't decide lightly to turn a flashlight toward your own badge. But the town's patience had been spent, and the department's credibility was a checking account with 2 digits left. Quiet calls were made, records requested. The deeper they looked, the more 1998 felt like a hallway lined with closed doors. Some marked with case numbers, some blank, all of them asking the same question: who was walking in and out without knocking. The lab in Lincoln upgraded its imaging system that summer. A machine that treated old evidence like it still had something to say. Ballistic fragments from a dozen unsolveds ran through the new lens, including the clean, shouting shards from Unit 23. A tech named Kim, steady hands, patient eyes, watched the screen assemble an image that had always been there and somehow never visible. The rifling sang a pattern now, not just scratches. When the match alert pinned, it sounded too cheerful for the room it landed in. The signature linked to a domestic dispute case out of Grand Island from the year before Jack's murder. No injuries. Shots fired into air in anger. A confiscated Smith & Wesson that should have slept forever on a steel shelf with a paper tag around its grip. But the marks matched, which meant the gun had gone on a field trip it shouldn't have, done something unforgivable, and then found its way home. When the call came to Fremont, the kind of call that turns oxygen to glass for a second, it didn't solve anything all at once. It did something trickier. It changed the geometry. The impossible murder had always felt like a circle you couldn't square. Suddenly there was a new shape to measure the space between a locked evidence room and a dead detective. That space wasn't big. It was a hallway, a key, a signature in ink that could be learned, mimicked, or worse, owned by someone who'd earned it. The list of people with access was long enough to be depressing and short enough to be terrifying. Evidence techs. A handful of state investigators, supervisors whose names looked wrong in the same paragraph as Jack's. The case file got a new tab, labeled in a hand that pressed too hard on its pen NTRNAL. The chief didn't sleep well that week or the weeks after. He knew what it would mean if the line from Grand Island to Maple Avenue ran through a badge. He also knew that ignoring a line, because it hurt, didn't make it less straight. Meanwhile, Fremont did what towns do when they're tired. It tried to be normal louder. The Harvest Festival still unfurled its banner across Main Street. Kids still ate kettle corn, still let the sugar coat their tongues until even grief tasted sweet for a minute. The high school football team ran onto the field under lights that hummed with muths and hope. Anna stood in the bleachers once, thumb on the edge of Jack's badge, and let the noise push back the quiet. A woman behind her said, "You're so brave," and Anna smiled, the kind of smile that keeps other people's worlds from wobbling. By Thanksgiving, the investigation had two speeds: slow in the open, fast in the dark. In the open, reporters heard phrases like ongoing review and interagency cooperation. In the dark, spreadsheets grew arteries, connecting access logs to shift calendars to conference travel to gas receipts to the mundane paper dust that gathers on a cop's life. A name began to show up too often to feel random. It didn't shout, it repeated. The way a lie repeats to become architecture. When the first snow of the second winter arrived, the flakes were fat and thudding, as if they'd trained all year for this one job. Fremont looked white and new again from a distance, like nothing bad had ever happened there. But people who lived inside the picture knew better. They'd learned to read the negative space, the places where a story should be and wasn't. They'd learned that sometimes the quietest rooms are the ones holding their breath. In a far corner of the state lab, the tech who'd run Jack's bullet fragments paused to stretch, then logged one more entry: comparison request completed, high confidence match, originating case file attached. She didn't know the way that sentence would unspool across friendships and careers, or how it would tilt the map hanging above Fremont's evidence board so that every pin pointed in one direction. She didn't need to. Her job was to hear metal speak. The rest would be up to people with keys, and people willing to use them. And in a small house on the east side, Anna set the table for two even though she would eat alone, because ritual is a way to insist the past still sits beside you. She lit a candle she didn't need, not for light but for proof. And for a brief moment the flame's reflection in the window looked like a siren you could choose to ignore. Then it steadied, and so did she. 2 decades later, the cardboard evidence boxes still smelled faintly of dust and disinfectant. They had been shifted from shelf to shelf, from one storage facility to another, always with the same label scrawled across their sides in fading marker: Walsh, Jack, 1998. Most officers had stopped glancing at them, the way you stop noticing a scar you've lived with for too long. But in 2018, those boxes found a second life. Nebraska had joined a federal initiative to re-examine unsolved homicides, pairing state labs with new technology, software, and fresh eyes. For the first time in years, Fremont's coldest file was pulled into fluorescent light. Detective Erin Malloy remembered the weight of the top box when she lifted it onto the table. She wasn't from Fremont, which gave her the gift of distance. She didn't carry the same grief etched into the local officers, but she respected it. The room she worked in wasn't much to look at: laminate table, humming light, a fan in the corner that never seemed to turn fully. But inside those bags and envelopes were threads time hadn't destroyed. Threads she believed might finally weave into a rope strong enough to drag the truth out. DNA had transformed since 1998. Back then, labs looked for whole drops of blood, visible hair follicles, obvious fluids. Now, a single skin cell trapped in fabric could speak louder than a confession. Malloy logged each item carefully: the fibers from Jack's sleeve, the faint smudge lifts from his door handle, even the paper coin rolls taken from his patrol truck. It seemed laughable then, who swabs cardboard for DNA? But protocols had changed. Tiny fragments were no longer ignored, they were opportunities. When the call came back from the lab, Malloy nearly missed it. She was driving between counties, a takeout coffee cooling in the passenger seat. The analyst's voice was calm, practiced, but her words rearranged the case overnight. A partial DNA profile had surfaced from the uniform fibers, one too degraded to identify outright, but strong enough to run through the national database. It didn't hit a direct match, but it found something almost as powerful: a familial lead. The system suggested the unknown male was closely related to a man arrested in Wayne County in 2007 for burglary. The man's name wasn't familiar to Fremont's history, but his brother's was. Ethan Ward. The name slid across Malloy's desk like a chill. The helpful neighbor, the furnace repairer, the man who had offered coffee back in 1998. His interview had sat in the file for 20 years, underlined but never circled. He had been polite, cooperative, ordinary to the point of invisibility, which, Malloy thought, might have been the point all along. She didn't rush to confront him. Cases like these collapse if you sprint. Instead, she began to build a scaffolding of proof around his name. She requested old shift schedules, cross-referenced alibis, traced Ward's employment records back through decades of small jobs and steady paychecks. On paper, he was clean. Too clean. Men who live in towns their entire lives leave behind a trail of small mistakes: parking tickets, late fees, unpaid tabs. Ward's file had gaps where human error should have been. She ordered trash pulls, the quiet kind done at dawn when nobody is watching. A team collected discarded coffee cups, fast food wrappers, anything Ward had touched. From a plastic lid smudged with grease, the lab pulled fresh DNA. When compared to the degraded profile on Jack's uniform, the probability came back in numbers so high they might as well have been certainty. Ward had been in contact with Jack the night he died. His skin cells, sealed in fabric for 20 years, said so. The discovery didn't just relight the case, it burned through the station like wildfire. For older officers, it was a gut punch. They remembered Ward as the neighbor who shoveled driveways, who showed up at search parties, who brought cocoa to volunteers in '98. For younger cops, it was proof that the nightmare theory whispered in classrooms and briefings was true. Sometimes the killer doesn't leave town. Sometimes he offers to help you look. Malloy kept her focus where it mattered: building a case that could stand in court. DNA alone would spark suspicion, but she needed the kind of narrative a jury could not wriggle free from. She requested the ballistics again, not because she expected a miracle, but because miracles happen when you stop expecting them. The state lab had recently installed an imaging system capable of rendering rifling patterns with microscopic precision. When the 38 bullet fragments from Jack's seat were fed into it, the machine sang a match. The bullet had the same signature as a Smith & Wesson revolver once checked into evidence in Grand Island in 1997 after a domestic dispute. That revolver had been signed out temporarily by none other than Ethan Ward, then working part-time as a county evidence clerk. According to logs, the gun had been returned, cleaned, and shelved. But the marks on Jack's bullet suggested otherwise. The gun had been taken for a darker purpose, then slipped back into storage before anyone noticed. It was the kind of revelation that hollowed your stomach. Fremont hadn't just lost its best detective to a killer. It had lost him to someone inside the system, someone trusted with the very tools meant to uphold justice. By the spring of 2019, the net was tightening. Ward, now older, balding, still living in Fremont, had no idea how close the walls were drawing in. He still attended town events, still nodded politely at neighbors, still carried the mask of helpfulness that had worked for decades. But his world was shrinking one warrant at a time. Malloy and her team built the arrest quietly, layering DNA, ballistics, and testimony until the story read like inevitability. They prepared for pushback, for lawyers to challenge chain of custody, for defense teams to cry contamination. They knew what they had was fragile in the way glass is fragile, shatterable, yes, but undeniable if you carried it carefully enough. When the warrant was signed, Malloy didn't feel triumph. She felt the weight of 20 years pressing down, demanding the next step be exact. They didn't kick down Ward's door. They called him in for a follow-up interview, the same phrase used in 1998, as if history itself was baiting him. Ward arrived calm, carrying the same mild smile he'd always worn. But this time the walls had teeth. Malloy laid out the DNA first. Ward shook his head, muttered about contamination. She followed with the ballistics, the revolver's ghost rising from the lab report. His smile faltered. Finally she pressed the timeline, the gap in his story that no longer held weight against science. The silence that filled the room was not denial. It was calculation, a man measuring which story might cost him fewer years. The case that had frozen Fremont for 2 decades had just thawed. And with it came the realization that the truth had been sitting 2 doors down from Jack Walsh's last patrol all along. The day Ethan Ward was arrested in Fremont will forever be etched into the town's memory, not because of flashing sirens or dramatic standoffs, but because of the sheer stillness that seemed to settle over the streets. Officers didn't storm his house. They didn't drag him out in front of neighbors. They simply knocked, spoke calmly, and placed handcuffs on wrists that had once shoveled snow for the same neighbors now peering from their curtains. For years, Ward had been a fixture of ordinary life, the man people waved to at the grocery store, the volunteer who helped organize community events, the friendly face who never raised suspicion. That mask fell quietly, but when it did, the silence was deafening. Ward shifted uneasily in the chair as evidence was stacked before him. DNA reports, ballistics analysis, photographs of the revolver he had once handled under the guise of official duty, all the puzzle pieces that finally formed a picture too clear to ignore. He tried to explain, first with denial, then with dismissal, then with the resigned silence of a man who knows the walls are closing in. Detectives didn't need a confession. Science had already spoken. When news of his arrest spread, Fremont froze. Some residents felt relief, others betrayal. But most were struck by the realization that the monster they feared had never been a shadowy stranger. He had been living among them, attending the same church services, standing in the same lines, smiling in the same photographs. People replayed every memory of Ward through a new, darker lens. The coffee he once served to search volunteers now tasted bitter in their recollection. The neighborly gestures that once seemed kind now felt like mockery. For Jack Walsh's family, the news was both a weight lifted and a fresh wound opened. His daughter, Emma, now grown with children of her own, stood in the courtroom when Ward was formally charged. She had spent decades telling her kids stories about the grandfather they never met, the officer who could calm chaos with nothing more than his steady voice. Seeing Ward shackled didn't erase her grief, but it gave her something grief had denied for years: a name, a face, a target for the anger she had carried like a second heartbeat. The trial began in 2021 inside a courthouse far from Fremont, chosen to avoid the suffocating pressure of small-town speculation. Reporters filled the benches, their cameras buzzing like locusts, feeding a national audience hungry for resolution. Prosecutors painted Ward as a man who used the privilege of access to commit the ultimate betrayal. They outlined how he removed the revolver from evidence, how he lingered near Walsh's patrol route, how he approached the detective in the quiet hours of a cold October morning and pulled the trigger through an open window. The defense tried to poke holes in the decades-old evidence. They called DNA degraded, chain of custody unreliable, witnesses forgetful. But each argument crumbled under the weight of science and persistence. The revolver's rifling marks matched, the DNA profile matched, and most damning of all, Walsh's handwritten notes surfaced, notes that revealed his growing suspicion of evidence tampering. his careful observations pointing directly toward Ward's unusual behavior in the months before his death. When Emma testified during the victim impact portion, the courtroom shifted. She didn't speak as the daughter of a legend. She spoke as the teenager who never got to hug her father goodbye, as the woman who carried 2 decades of unanswered questions. Her words cut sharper than any forensic report. She described the nights staring at the empty chair at family dinners, the milestones her father missed, the way grief never left but hardened into suspicion that the world would never be safe again. "You didn't just kill my father," she told Ward, voice steady. "You killed the trust of an entire town." Jurors needed less than a day. The guilty verdicts fell one after another: murder, evidence tampering, abuse of authority. Ward sat motionless, lips pressed into a line, the same expression he wore when officers first knocked on his door. For Fremont, it wasn't celebration that followed, but something quieter: release. The sentencing brought closure not through vengeance but through accountability. Ward received life without parole, a punishment not just for the murder but for the years of deception that followed. The judge called it a betrayal of the highest order, a crime that struck at the very heart of community trust. And with the bang of the gavel, the case that had haunted Fremont for more than 20 years was finally stamped with an ending. But endings don't erase scars. Fremont moved forward, but differently. Neighbors locked their doors more often. Parents kept closer watch over their children. The police department implemented new protocols, stricter evidence control, mandatory outside oversight. A mural of Jack Walsh was painted on the wall of the local precinct, a reminder of both the cost of corruption and the resilience of a community unwilling to let darkness win. True crime enthusiasts across the country dissected the case in podcasts and documentaries. They called it "the perfect crime that failed," a story of patience, science, and the way truth sometimes takes decades to surface. But in Fremont, it wasn't entertainment. It was lived history, a scar woven into the identity of the town itself. For every family who once sat at a diner booth Jack had walked past, for every neighbor who once accepted Ward's polite nod, the case wasn't just a headline. It was a reminder that evil doesn't always wear a stranger's face. Sometimes it lives 2 doors down. In the years that followed, the Walsh case became a textbook example in law enforcement academies, taught as both cautionary tale and beacon of hope. Instructors highlighted the importance of preserving evidence, no matter how cold a case grows. They showed how advances in DNA technology and ballistics imaging could rewrite endings once thought permanent. And they emphasized the lesson that Jack himself believed in, that right and wrong are not just legal definitions but truths worth defending, even when it costs everything. Emma kept her father's journal. She said it was the closest she would ever get to hearing his voice again. On quiet nights, she'd read the pages, tracing the lines with her fingers, imagining the weight of the pen in his steady hand. The last entry, the one hinting at Ward's activities, now read like prophecy. Her father had been close to the truth, so close that it had cost him his life. But in the end, his notes helped ensure justice was not denied forever. For Fremont, closure didn't mean forgetting. Every October, residents gather for a memorial walk down Maple Avenue, stopping near the spot where Jack's patrol car once sat. They light candles, share stories, and remind one another that while safety may be fragile, community is forged strongest in fire. The man who once symbolized betrayal is locked away. The man who symbolized integrity lives on in the stories told to children who never met him but know his name. And so the radio static that began this story, the crackle that once hung unanswered, finally found its response. Not from Jack Walsh, but from the voices of an entire town that refused to let him be silenced forever. His legacy was not the night he died, but the justice that rose decades later, proving that even when darkness hides in plain sight, truth has a way of breaking through.